You don't usually question fate because it feels like something that happens to you. But what if fate is not something that happens to you, but something you quietly construct every time you try to avoid it? Why does the mind believe it is escaping a future when in reality it might be walking directly into it? In the world of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Thebes is not just a city. It is a closed system of meaning, where truth is not hidden, it is reactive. A prophecy is not a script carved into stone. It is a trigger embedded inside human behavior. And the moment someone tries to escape it, the system begins to respond. Here is the first rupture in logic: Oedipus does not follow fate. He interacts with it. Every decision is rational. Every step is justified. Every action feels like control. And yet, control becomes the mechanism of collapse. Microshift: what if intelligence does not protect you from destiny, but refines the path toward it? Tiresias, the blind prophet, introduces a contradiction that destabilizes everything. He sees without seeing. He knows without proving. And in that paradox lies the system's first warning: truth does not arrive as clarity, it arrives as resistance. The more Oedipus resists, the more the structure tightens around him. And this is where the psychological mechanism begins to surface. Denial is not absence of truth, it is fuel for it. Jocasta's rejection of prophecy is not ignorance, it is containment failure. The attempt to stabilize reality actually accelerates its breakdown. Scale shift: this is no longer a story about a king. It becomes a model of how perception constructs inevitability itself. Because here is the unsettling insight: Oedipus is not punished for what he knows. He is shaped by what he refuses to accept. Every attempt to avoid a predicted outcome becomes an input into that outcome. Not through magic, but through interpretation, fear, and decision-making loops. And suddenly, fate stops looking like external force. It starts looking like behavioral recursion. Memory fragment: a man changing direction on a road, only to discover every alternative path was already turning him back toward the same point. So the real question is no longer whether prophecy is true. The question becomes, what kind of mind makes a prophecy come alive? The consequence is subtle but absolute. If your decisions are driven by avoidance, then avoidance becomes your architecture. You do not escape the pattern, you refine it. You become the most efficient version of the outcome you fear. And yet the most dangerous part is this: it still feels like freedom. Because the system does not force you. It lets you choose, while shaping what choice means. So if every attempt to avoid a future can help create it, then what exactly is choice supposed to be protecting you from? And deeper still, if awareness does not break the loop, but intensifies it, then where does control actually begin, or end, in a system where even resistance is part of the design? The deeper you go into the structure behind Oedipus, the more unsettling the question becomes: is fate something written before action, or something generated by the act of trying to escape it? Because if the first layer revealed a system where resistance feeds the outcome, then the second layer forces a more uncomfortable realization: the system does not need certainty. It only needs interpretation. What happens when human beings are forced to act on incomplete meaning? Scale shift: Thebes is no longer just a city under prophecy. It becomes a psychological laboratory where knowledge is fragmented, authority is unstable, and every decision is made under the pressure of unseen consequences. Tiresias enters again in this structure, not as a character, but as a function. He is not simply the one who knows. He is the point where knowledge becomes untransferable. And that creates the second contradiction: truth exists, but it cannot be absorbed without distortion. So the real tension is not ignorance versus knowledge. It is knowledge versus survivability. Memory fragment: a warning spoken too clearly to be accepted, not because it is unclear, but because it is too complete. Jocasta's role deepens here as well. She is not merely denial. She is stabilization logic. The mind's attempt to preserve coherence when reality becomes too expensive to process. But stabilization has a cost. The more she smooths the truth, the more the system builds pressure underneath it. And that pressure does not stay symbolic. It becomes behavioral. Here is the escalation. Oedipus does not chase fate blindly. He constructs it through rational escalation. Every clue he investigates is reasonable. Every suspicion is justified. Every step forward is logical. But logic, when operating inside incomplete information, becomes a self-amplifying loop. Contradiction emerges sharply. Rationality does not guarantee escape. It can intensify convergence toward the very outcome it tries to avoid. What if intelligence is not the antidote to fate, but its most efficient delivery mechanism? And this is where the system reveals its second mechanism, compression. As Oedipus moves closer to truth, the number of possible interpretations collapses. Options shrink. Meaning sharpens. And reality becomes less flexible with every answer uncovered. Revelation begins to surface, not as clarity, but as narrowing. The path does not open. It closes. Memory fragment, a corridor of doors, each open door removing every other possibility behind it. Scale shift, this is no longer about prophecy. It becomes about cognitive architecture itself, how the brain behaves when certainty is demanded in an uncertain world. Because the most dangerous moment is not ignorance. It is partial knowledge acting under urgency. And urgency changes everything. It accelerates interpretation. It distorts probability. It turns signals into convictions. And convictions into irreversible motion. So the consequence is not simply tragedy. The consequence is structural. Once interpretation becomes action, and action becomes evidence, the system no longer needs external force. It becomes self-propagating. And now the mystery deepens further. If every step toward truth reduces available outcomes, then is truth something that liberates, or something that eliminates alternatives until only one path remains? And if that narrowing is inevitable, then the final question becomes even more unsettling. At what point does the search for truth stop being discovery and start becoming construction? At this point in the system, something subtle but irreversible has already changed. The question is no longer whether the future can be avoided. The question is whether the act of understanding the future has already rewritten the structure of choice itself. So what happens when every possible decision starts to feel like evidence of a predetermined outcome? Deep context, Oedipus is no longer operating as a single agent moving through events. He is functioning as a feedback loop inside a collapsing interpretation system. Every new clue does not expand possibility. It refines convergence. And convergence, once accelerated, begins to feel like inevitability. This is where the third contradiction emerges. The more precise the search for truth becomes, the less room there is for alternative explanations. Precision does not create freedom. It reduces ambiguity. And ambiguity, in this system, is the only thing that keeps outcomes from locking into place. So intelligence becomes a paradoxical force. It is both illumination and constraint. Memory fragment, a map so accurate that it no longer shows the territory, only the path that must be taken once the map is believed. Escalation begins here. The system is no longer reacting to external prophecy. It is reacting to internal certainty. Oedipus is not chasing destiny. He is narrowing the shape of reality until only one interpretation can survive the pressure of his own reasoning. And the influence of Tiresias becomes even more structurally important. Not as a character delivering information, but as a point of resistance in the system. His knowledge does not integrate smoothly. It fractures interpretation. And anything that fractures interpretation inside a closed system increases instability. Contradiction deepens. Truth is supposed to stabilize understanding, but here it destabilizes identity. Because identity requires continuity. And continuity requires selective ignorance. When nothing can remain unexamined, nothing can remain intact. Revelation begins to sharpen, but not fully arrive. It is still incomplete, still fragmented. Yet its direction is becoming unmistakable. Every attempt to clarify origin points pulls Oedipus closer to a structure he cannot cognitively escape. Memory fragment is the witness searching for evidence, unaware that each piece of evidence is removing another version of themselves. Scale shift, this is no longer a story of prophecy. It becomes a model of epistemic collapse, where knowing too much too quickly eliminates the psychological architecture needed to survive what is known. And this is where consequence turns structural. The system does not punish ignorance. It punishes incomplete integration of truth. Because partial truth forces action without full comprehension, and action inside uncertainty always produces irreversible pathways. So every step forward is not progress. It is commitment. And commitment, once accumulated, becomes indistinguishable from destiny. Now the question shifts again. If every interpretation reduces possible futures, and every action commits you further into the narrowed field of outcomes, then what remains of choice except the illusion of timing? Because even hesitation becomes part of the structure. Even delay becomes data. And the deeper mystery begins to surface through the cracks of this system. If truth always collapses possibility into direction, then is awareness ever neutral, or is awareness itself the mechanism that selects the ending? And if that is true, then the most unsettling implication remains unfinished, hovering just beyond clarity, waiting for what comes next. At this stage, the system is no longer asking whether truth is known or unknown. It is asking something far more destabilizing: what if truth only becomes visible at the exact moment it stops being useful? Because every layer so far has pointed toward a single structural tension, knowledge does not liberate Oedipus, it narrows him. But now the deeper mechanism begins to surface. Not as prediction. Not as resistance. But as design. So the question becomes, what if the prophecy was never about the future at all? Revelation begins here. The prophecy does not function as information. It functions as a behavioral mirror. It does not describe what will happen. It defines the conditions under which human cognition will collapse into self-confirmation. And Oedipus is not trapped because the prophecy is true. He is trapped because he treats it as something that must be defeated. That is the hidden mechanism. Memory fragment, a man holding a warning so tightly that his grip becomes the proof of what he feared. Revelation sharpens further. Tiresias is not simply a truth bearer. He is a structural exception. A node inside the system that does not react to interpretation. This creates an imbalance. Because in any closed cognitive loop, one non-reactive element becomes the anchor around which all reactive elements reorganize. So Oedipus does not spiral toward truth. He spirals around a fixed point of unchangeable knowledge. Deep insight emerges. Fate is not a script. It is a feedback architecture. The system does not require the future to be predetermined. It only requires that human beings interpret signals in ways that reduce their own degrees of freedom over time. And once that reduction begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. Consequence: every attempt to verify truth increases commitment to a narrowing path. Investigation becomes fixation. Clarification becomes compression. An identity becomes indistinguishable from pursuit. Memory fragment, a traveler walking through fog, convinced the fog is hiding something, unaware that every step is shaping the fog into a corridor. Scale shift, this is no longer about mythic characters or divine prophecy. This becomes a model for how consciousness behaves inside uncertainty itself. When meaning is incomplete, the mind does not wait. It constructs continuity. And that construction becomes destiny. Oedipus is not discovering who he is. He is assembling himself through interpretation of incomplete signals. Each interpretation removes alternative versions of himself that could have existed. And this is the most important structural reversal: identity is not revealed. Identity is collapsed into existence through selection pressure created by interpretation. So what appears as fate is actually the residue of all paths that were eliminated by the need to know. And yet the system still feels external. That is the final illusion. Because the prophecy does not force action. It defines a space where action becomes inevitable once interpretation begins. Greater question emerges, heavier than before: if the act of trying to understand reality is what progressively eliminates alternative outcomes, then is consciousness itself a mechanism of convergence, slowly turning possibility into a single unavoidable line? The most unsettling realization is not that the future can be predicted, or even that it can be avoided only to be recreated. The deepest rupture is something far more internal. What if the structure of reality does not respond to what is true, but to what the mind is forced to complete when truth is incomplete? Because at this point, every layer has converged into a single hidden mechanism. Not prophecy. Not fate. Not divine will. But a system where incomplete understanding compels completion, and completion becomes causation. Core revelation emerges. Oedipus does not fall because he is chosen. He falls because the human mind cannot tolerate unresolved meaning without turning it into action. The prophecy is only the initial disturbance. The real engine is psychological closure pressure. Memory fragment, a puzzle missing one piece, where the hand searching for the final piece accidentally reshapes the entire picture into something it never originally was. This is the hidden architecture. Oedipus is not reacting to destiny. He is reacting to cognitive discomfort. Every investigation he performs is an attempt to eliminate ambiguity. Every eliminated ambiguity reduces possible interpretations of himself. And every reduction narrows the space of identity until only one configuration remains stable enough to survive interpretation. That is the true collapse point. Insight expansion, Tiresias does not cause fate. He interrupts ambiguity. And in systems driven by uncertainty intolerance, interruption is not clarification. It is acceleration toward convergence. The presence of absolute knowledge inside a partial knowledge system does not stabilize it. It destabilizes everything that still depends on uncertainty to function. So the tragedy is not ignorance versus knowledge. It is the human requirement that knowledge must resolve itself completely, even when resolution destroys the subject who requires it. Memory fragment, a light turned on inside a closed room so bright that every shadow needed for orientation disappears, leaving only structure without escape. Consequences begin to unfold across scale. At the individual level, identity becomes self-reconstructing under pressure of interpretation. At the relational level, truth fractures trust because it removes shared ambiguity. At the systemic level, societies built on prediction and certainty begin to lock themselves into outcomes they believe they are preventing. Oedipus is not an exception. He is a demonstration. Scale shift intensifies. This is no longer about mythic inevitability. It is about any system where human beings demand resolution from uncertainty faster than uncertainty can be lived in. The more aggressively a system tries to eliminate unknowns, the more it manufactures deterministic pathways through its own corrective behavior. And in that sense, fate is not external. It is emergent. Philosophical reflection deepens into a final structural tension. If consciousness requires completion to stabilize meaning, but completion reduces possibility until only one outcome survives, then consciousness itself becomes the mechanism that transforms probability into inevitability. Not through force. Not through design. But through necessity. So the final question does not ask whether fate exists. It asks whether any mind, once it begins to resolve uncertainty, can avoid becoming the author of a single unavoidable ending it believes it is merely discovering. What remains after everything collapses is not the truth Oedipus discovered, but the irreversible cost of needing truth to behave like certainty. Because the consequence of this entire structure is not confined to one man, one city, or one moment in myth. It expands outward like a system that continues to operate even after its origin has disappeared. Once interpretation becomes the engine of convergence, every act of clarification leaves a residue, something that cannot be undone. And that residue is identity shaped by narrowing. Memory fragment, a traveler who reaches the end of a road only to realize the road was not leading somewhere, but gradually erasing every other direction that once existed. The immediate consequence is psychological collapse, but not in the way it is often assumed. It is not shock alone. It is the sudden recognition that every choice made in pursuit of clarity was simultaneously eliminating the conditions required for alternative selves to exist. Oedipus is no longer a figure trapped by fate. He becomes the afterimage of every decision that reduced ambiguity in exchange for understanding. Expansion reveals something even more unsettling. The system does not end with revelation. It stabilizes after revelation. Once the narrowing process completes, the mind does not return to freedom. It enters a state where meaning has been fully resolved, but at the cost of all remaining possibility. And this is where legacy begins. Legacy is not what is remembered. Legacy is what continues to function after the story ends. In this structure, Oedipus becomes more than a tragic figure. He becomes a cognitive model embedded in human reasoning itself. Every time a mind prioritizes resolution over uncertainty, every time it demands a complete answer before allowing ambiguity to exist, the same architecture reactivates. Memory fragment, a blind figure not because he cannot see, but because seeing fully required sacrificing every incomplete version of reality that once allowed movement. Scale shift, this is no longer about ancient Thebes. This is about any system, psychological, social, or technological, where prediction and certainty are treated as goals rather than limitations. The more advanced a system becomes at eliminating unknowns, the more it risks collapsing into outcomes it believed it was preventing. Because elimination of ambiguity is not neutral. It is directional. And once direction becomes irreversible, control becomes retrospective illusion. The deeper legacy of this structure is unsettling. Human beings do not simply discover outcomes. They participate in constructing the space in which outcomes become inevitable. Not through intention, but through intolerance for incomplete meaning. Reflection intensifies here. The tragedy is not that Oedipus could not escape fate. The tragedy is that escape required him to stop seeking certainty, but stopping would have required accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition of existence. And that is something consciousness resists at its core level. Memory fragment, a mind holding a question so tightly that the question reshapes the mind until it can no longer imagine not answering it. So the consequence extends beyond myth into behavior itself. Every attempt to fully resolve uncertainty becomes a structural force that reduces the number of futures a system can hold. Over time, possibility is not destroyed suddenly. It is quietly filtered out through the need for coherence. And what remains is not truth, but finality. So the final unresolved tension is not about what Oedipus did or what he could have done differently. It is about what kind of intelligent structure inevitably converts uncertainty into singularity, and whether awareness itself carries the same cost every time it demands completion. Because if every mind seeks closure, and closure always reduces possibility, then what exactly survives inside a system that cannot tolerate the unfinished? What remains after every layer of interpretation collapses is not certainty, and not even uncertainty, but the awareness that the mind was never observing reality from a distance. It was actively shaping the corridor through which reality could be seen. At the deepest level, the story stops being about prophecy, knowledge, or escape. It becomes about the structure of a consciousness that cannot leave meaning unfinished. A consciousness that treats incompleteness not as a state to exist in, but as a problem that must be resolved at any cost. And that is where everything converges into its final insight. There is no external force guiding the outcome. There is only the internal pressure of a mind that refuses to tolerate open loops. Memory fragment, a figure standing at a crossroads, but every time one path is examined too closely, the other paths begin to fade as if they were never stable to begin with. Legacy is what remains when the illusion of choice is stripped of its emotional weight. Not because choice is meaningless, but because choice is always made inside boundaries defined by what the mind is willing to leave unresolved. The moment resolution becomes mandatory, possibility begins to contract. And that contraction is the invisible architecture behind every tragedy that feels inevitable in hindsight. Oedipus is not preserved in memory because of what happened to him. He is preserved because he exposes a pattern that does not stay inside mythology. It repeats in every system where knowledge is treated as something that must be complete, where uncertainty is treated as something that must be eliminated, and where interpretation is mistaken for control. Memory fragment, a man realizing too late that every answer he demanded removed a version of himself that could no longer exist once the answer arrived. The human meaning of this structure is not punishment, and not fate. It is the realization that consciousness does not simply perceive the world. It filters it through an unbearable need for coherence. And in that need, it quietly trades possibility for clarity, again and again, until only one version of reality remains stable enough to survive attention. That is why the narrative still matters. Not because it explains ancient belief in prophecy, but because it reveals a mechanism that still operates inside modern thinking. Every time prediction replaces patience, every time explanation replaces uncertainty, every time closure is valued more than openness, the same narrowing process begins again. And what is left at the end of that narrowing is not truth in its purest form, but truth reduced to something the mind can finally stop questioning. Final reflection: perhaps the deepest tension was never between freedom and destiny, but between a mind that needs the world to remain open, and a mind that cannot survive without closing it. And if awareness itself always moves toward closure, then the question that remains is not what fate decides, but what kind of consciousness survives inside a reality that can only remain infinite as long as it is never fully understood.